Hello again. As I mentioned in my last video, how do I come up with video ideas is because I usually hear something that somebody said or they're teaching or a church does something and I want to react to it, give a little different opinion. And this morning we're going to talk about the word grace. Now, for outsiders, people that are not in the Christian religion, so to speak, I might need to give a little bit of explanation for that, but the insiders will know what I talk about. Grace is a huge buzzword in Protestant evangelical circles. I will explain what grace means when I was in church for a really long time, and it meant that so you don't want to be legalistic, but you want to understand that God gives you grace. So legalism is following rules. Mostly that comes from the fact that there's the Old Testament law of Moses. Those are the rules, the Ten Commandments. But we're not supposed to follow that. But if we follow any other kind of rules in our Christian lives, then that's legalism, and what God has for us is grace. Grace meaning that we fall short of a standard that God has, but He forgives it, and He says, I'll give you a pass. That's what grace means. All right, so I got a couple of dudes up in Iowa that are doing this super good work, podcasts and books, called Growing in Grace Podcast. And I was listening to one of the guys this morning, and it occurred to me that this word grace just always, we need to talk about it, because I think what they mean is not growing in grace, but growing in freedom. And that is probably more accurate, biblically speaking. What grace means is that there's a standard that God has, but He forgives when you don't reach it. Now, where this concept comes from is not understanding that Jesus was teaching the law in the Gospels. We think that Jesus' teaching is a standard that God has for all of us, and then that's kind of what the ideal is, and we can't attain it, but we try to, and when we can't, God shows us grace. He forgives it. That's where this idea comes from. That's where the root of the idea came from in the church that I was in for 40 years. And the problem is that Jesus was teaching specifically to Israel. Now, so when we talk about the word grace, the reason it just always makes me cringe now is because that word means that there's a standard and you didn't reach it, so God forgives you. And that's what we think is great. That's great. We're growing in grace. We're growing in this idea. And I don't think that's what these guys in Iowa mean. But here's the thing. What is the standard that God is holding us to that we're falling short of? If we, as people today, everybody, Jews and Gentiles, are not supposed to follow the law of Moses, then what is the standard? Jesus taught the law of Moses. That was the standard for Israel. For everybody nowadays after the cross, what is the standard? There isn't one. This is why Paul said in Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. He says it twice, freedom twice. You can see in his mind that he was like, what these people think is that it is for freedom that God has been nice to us or something like that, so that when we fail, He forgives us, and that's grace. Paul says it twice. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Christ has set you free for freedom, to be free. What does that mean? There's several verses in the New Testament that say the Holy Spirit is like the wind. It comes and goes, and it can't be contained, and it's free. It is the definition of freedom. Where the Spirit of God is, there is freedom. That is a very famous verse in Corinthians. And that is the deal. Where did we get this idea that there's a standard of behavior that God has for us, of moral behavior, and if we don't attain it, then God's unhappy, but he gives us grace? Where did this idea come from? I kind of want to reiterate it again. I want to beat the dead horse. It comes from the fact that people are mixing in, like, the law of Moses, old covenant stuff into Christianity. How does that happen? Because we think that Jesus is teaching Christians, when Jesus was teaching the law of Moses specifically to Israel, and they were the only ones that were ever meant to follow it or pay attention to it. Gentiles were never a part of that. Okay, now here's the thing. I can talk about this for the next 40 years if I live that long, and that's, being generous. And this idea will probably still barely sink in to the human psyche. And why is that? It's because to be a Christian means that you follow Jesus, and when you open up the Gospels, it seems like Jesus is teaching directly to me as somebody that likes Jesus and wants to follow Jesus. Doesn't that make sense? It seems very logical and it seems to make sense. But you have to read the entire Bible and understand context and culture to realize, look, it seems super weird, the idea that if God would come to earth, that he would constrain himself to be a Jewish guy who's a Jewish teacher who is only teaching a specific group of Israel people. What we like to believe is that if God came to earth, he would universally get out a megaphone and tell everybody how to live and what the rules are and what's going on. Because it's God. He's not going to be ethnically constrained or nationally constrained. But the thing is that the Bible, that is the biblical message. So we don't have the license to say, I don't like that. I can't imagine God constraining himself to be a Jewish teacher of only the Mosaic law to only his people that he was born into. That just seems too narrow. We can't deal with it. Natural human racism can't deal with it. It's not even so. I don't mean to say that as to be a statement of like, this is an issue of racism in the 21st century that is causing this. No. I understand it. I was for 40 years. This is what I thought too, because I thought that it made sense. All right. So to wrap it up, when we use the word grace, that word means that there is a standard that you fell short of, but it is forgiven. So when we apply that to God, that means that we're saying God has a standard that we didn't live up to, but he forgives us. And then in the church I grew up in, it means that you go out and you try to do better, but God is still working with you, but he's still looking for a certain standard of behavior, and if you don't, but that is not it. So what we're talking about is not grace, but freedom. That is what we need to be going towards. All right, I went super long again.